The cameras were rolling, the audience was cheering, and then 17-year-old Luna Martinez stood at the Family Feud podium, with her hands gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles had turned white, her breathing shallow and rapid as she fought against the overwhelming terror that had been her constant companion for the past 2 years, a terror so profound and all-consuming that leaving her house had become nearly impossible, and being here, surrounded by hundreds of strangers under bright lights, felt like facing death itself. When Steve Harvey asked about your biggest fears, Luna's response would be unlike anything he had ever witnessed, not just an answer, but a complete breakdown that revealed the devastating reality of living with panic disorder and agoraphobia so severe it had turned her world into a prison of terror. Luna couldn't breathe. The question had triggered something primal and overwhelming, and suddenly the studio lights seemed too bright, the audience noise too loud, the space too confined. Her vision began to tunnel. Her heart started racing so fast she was convinced she was having a heart attack, and the familiar wave of absolute terror that she knew meant she was about to die, even though she had been told hundreds of times that panic attacks couldn't kill her, began washing over her entire body. "I'm afraid of dying and living at the same time," Luna managed to whisper before her voice disappeared entirely, her whole body beginning to shake as the full force of a panic attack took hold, leaving her frozen at the podium while her mind screamed that she was in mortal danger and needed to escape immediately. Luna Martinez had been living with severe anxiety disorder for 2 years, ever since the night she had experienced her first panic attack at age 15, during what should have been a normal evening of homework and television. The attack had come without warning, without any obvious trigger, transforming an ordinary Tuesday into the beginning of a nightmare that would fundamentally alter every aspect of her existence and turn her from an outgoing, active teenager into someone who could barely leave her bedroom without experiencing overwhelming terror. The first panic attack had been so severe and realistic that Luna had been convinced she was dying. The racing heart, shortness of breath, dizziness, an overwhelming sense of impending doom had sent her to the emergency room, where doctors had run extensive tests only to find nothing physically wrong with her. When they had explained that she had experienced a panic attack, Luna had felt both relief and confusion. Relief that she wasn't dying, but confusion about why her body had betrayed her so completely and convincingly. But the relief had been short-lived because the panic attacks had continued, becoming more frequent and more severe despite every treatment her family had tried. What had started as occasional episodes had evolved into a constant state of fear. Fear of having another panic attack, fear of being in places where escape might be difficult, fear of the fear itself that had created a cycle of anxiety that seemed impossible to break. Luna's agoraphobia had developed gradually, as her panic attacks had become associated with specific places and situations. First, she had stopped going to movie theaters because the darkness and inability to leave quickly had triggered attacks. Then she had stopped going to restaurants, shopping malls, and friends' houses. Eventually, even going to school had become impossible, and Luna had been forced to complete her education through online programs that allowed her to stay in the safety of her home. The impact on Luna's family had been devastating and confusing. Her parents, Maria and Carlos Martinez, had watched their vibrant social daughter transform into someone who spent most of her time in her bedroom, who couldn't participate in family outings or social events, who lived in constant terror of experiences that most people took for granted. They had tried everything: therapy, medication, alternative treatments, support groups, but nothing had provided lasting relief from Luna's overwhelming anxiety. Luna's younger brother Miguel had struggled to understand why his sister, who had once been his playmate and protector, could no longer function in normal situations. He had felt guilty when the family had been forced to skip vacations, birthday parties, and family gatherings because Luna couldn't handle being away from home. But he had also felt frustrated and confused by the invisible illness that had stolen his sister from him. The most difficult aspect of Luna's anxiety disorder was the way it had been misunderstood by people who didn't experience it themselves. Well-meaning relatives and family friends had suggested that Luna was being dramatic, that she needed to just relax or think positive thoughts, that her anxiety was a choice or a lack of willpower rather than a genuine medical condition that was beyond her control. Luna had internalized much of this criticism, feeling ashamed and guilty about her inability to function normally, wondering whether she was weak or defective in some fundamental way that made her incapable of handling life experiences that everyone else managed without difficulty. The shame had become another layer of suffering on top of the anxiety itself, creating isolation and self-blame that made recovery even more challenging. The decision to apply for Family Feud had been made during one of Luna's brief periods of improvement, when a new medication had seemed to reduce her anxiety enough that she had felt hopeful about the possibility of participating in normal activities again. Her family had thought that having a goal and something positive to look forward to might help motivate her continued progress and provide a sense of accomplishment if she could manage to participate. But as the taping date had approached, Luna's anxiety had returned with increased intensity. The prospect of traveling to the studio, being surrounded by strangers, performing under pressure, and being on television had triggered weeks of anticipatory anxiety that had been almost as debilitating as the panic attacks themselves. Luna had wanted to cancel their appearance multiple times, but her family had encouraged her to try, believing that successfully completing the experience might help her rebuild confidence in her ability to handle challenging situations. The journey to the studio had been a tremendous challenge for Luna, requiring careful planning, anxiety medication, and the constant presence of her family for support and reassurance. Even with all these accommodations, Luna had experienced several panic attacks during the travel process and had seriously considered turning back multiple times. During the pre-show preparations, Luna had been visibly anxious and withdrawn, participating in the required activities, but clearly struggling with the noise, lights, and crowds of people involved in television production. The production team had been understanding and patient, allowing Luna extra time and space to acclimate to the environment, but they hadn't fully understood the severity of her condition or the courage it had taken for her to be there at all. The game had been proceeding with Luna participating minimally, giving brief answers when absolutely necessary, but otherwise trying to remain as inconspicuous as possible to avoid drawing attention that might trigger her anxiety. Her family had been supportive and protective, trying to shield her from unnecessary pressure while still including her in the experience they had hoped would be positive and empowering. But when it came time for the category Your Biggest Fears, and it was Luna's turn at the buzzer, the question had struck directly at the core of her daily existence and the terror that had defined every moment of the past 2 years. Steve Harvey had approached the podium with his usual warm energy, but something about Luna's obvious distress and the way she was gripping the podium had made him more gentle and attentive than usual. "All right, Luna," Steve had said softly, "your biggest fears. What comes to mind?" Luna had looked at Steve with eyes wide with terror, her breathing becoming more rapid and shallow as the familiar sensations of panic began to overwhelm her. "I'm afraid of dying and living at the same time," Luna had whispered, and then her body had betrayed her completely as a full-scale panic attack had taken hold. Steve had immediately recognized that something serious was happening that went far beyond normal nervousness about being on television. He had seen contestants who were anxious, excited, or overwhelmed, but this was different. This was someone experiencing genuine medical distress. "Luna," Steve had said quietly, moving closer to her with deliberate calm, "I want you to look at me and listen to my voice. You're safe here. Nothing bad is going to happen to you." But Luna's panic attack had continued to escalate. Her heart was racing so fast she could feel it pounding in her chest, her vision was becoming blurry, and she was convinced that she was either having a heart attack or losing her mind. The studio lights seemed to be closing in on her, the audience noise was overwhelming, and every instinct was telling her she needed to run immediately. Steve had turned to signal the production team to stop recording, understanding that this young woman needed medical attention rather than entertainment pressure. "Luna," Steve had said, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that comes from someone who understands crisis situations, "I want you to try something with me. We're going to breathe together, okay? In through your nose, slow and deep." Steve had begun demonstrating slow, deep breathing, speaking in a rhythm that was designed to help Luna focus on something other than her panic. "That's good," Steve had said as Luna tried to follow his breathing pattern. "Now out through your mouth, slow and controlled. You're doing great." The studio had fallen completely silent as everyone present understood they were witnessing something that transcended game show entertainment and entered the realm of genuine human crisis and medical emergency. Steve had continued working with Luna, using techniques he had learned from his own experiences with anxiety and from mental health professionals who had advised him about helping contestants who were struggling. "Luna," Steve had said gently, "what you're feeling right now is real, but it's not dangerous. Your body is trying to protect you from something that isn't actually threatening you. You're having a panic attack and it's going to pass." Luna had managed to make eye contact with Steve, using his calm presence as an anchor while her body continued to experience the overwhelming sensations of panic. "I can't make it stop," Luna had whispered between rapid breaths. "I feel like I'm dying." "I know it feels that way," Steve had replied with understanding, "but you're not dying, you're having an anxiety response, and even though it feels terrible, it can't actually hurt you." Steve had begun removing his suit jacket, but this time the gesture was about providing comfort and security rather than symbolic meaning. "Luna," Steve had said, placing the jacket gently around her shoulders, "this is going to help you feel a little more protected and grounded. Sometimes when we're having panic attacks, having something soft and secure around us can help." Luna had pulled the jacket closer, the weight and warmth providing some small comfort amid the overwhelming terror she was experiencing. Steve had turned to address Luna's family, who were watching with obvious distress and concern. "Has Luna been getting help for this?" Steve had asked quietly. "We've tried everything," Maria Martinez had replied, tears in her eyes. "Therapy, medication, support groups. This is the first time she's left the house in months. We thought she was getting better." Steve had nodded with understanding and compassion. "Luna," Steve had said, turning back to her, "I want you to know that what you're dealing with is real, and it's not your fault. Anxiety disorders are medical conditions, just like diabetes or heart disease. They're not something you can just will away or think your way out of." Luna had looked up at Steve, her panic attack beginning to subside slightly as she focused on his words and presence. "But I feel so weak," Luna had said. "Everyone else can do normal things, and I can't even leave my house without feeling like I'm going to die." "Luna," Steve had replied, "you're not weak. You're here, aren't you? You traveled to this studio, you're standing on this stage, you're facing your fears head on. That's not weakness, that's incredible courage." Steve had turned to address the studio audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve had announced, "Luna Martinez is showing us something extraordinary today. She's dealing with an anxiety disorder that makes everyday activities feel like life or death situations, but she's here anyway. That's what real bravery looks like." The game had been suspended while Luna received medical attention and support from mental health professionals who were brought in to help her through the crisis. Steve had remained with her throughout the process, providing continuity and reassurance during what was clearly a terrifying experience. The episode was never broadcast in its intended format, but Luna's story became a powerful educational tool for mental health awareness. The production team worked with anxiety disorder specialists to create content that helped viewers understand the reality of panic disorders and the importance of compassion and support for people dealing with mental health challenges. Luna had kept Steve's jacket as a symbol of the moment, when her invisible illness became visible and met with understanding rather than judgment. More importantly, the experience had connected her family with new resources and treatment approaches that ultimately proved more effective than previous interventions. Steve Harvey had learned something profound about the hidden battles that people fight every day, the courage it takes to face overwhelming fear, and the importance of treating mental health conditions with the same seriousness and compassion that society shows for physical illnesses. The jacket that Steve had given Luna became a treasured possession, representing not just comfort during her worst moment, but the understanding that mental illness is real, treatable, and nothing to be ashamed of. Because that's what courage looks like when it faces its greatest fear and survives. That's what compassion sounds like when it meets mental illness with understanding rather than judgment. And that's what happens when someone who has been fighting an invisible battle finally finds people who can see their struggle, validate their experience, and help them understand that seeking help is not weakness, but the first step toward healing and hope. Luna Martinez had spent 2 years trapped by her own mind, but on that day at Family Feud, she discovered that even in her moments of greatest terror, she was not alone, and that the fear that had controlled her life could be faced with support, understanding, and the knowledge that recovery, while difficult, was possible.